We're back. Episode 3, East Rosebud Studios with the great Phil Gonzalez. And, let's face it, you're just talking. I don't have to do any interview because there's no way that I can really talk about your career in an hour. Right? During our break, our producer Lydia was in here, and I was just sitting there shaking my head about you talking about Dan Bailey. And it's just hard for me to picture, in the history of fly fishing in the Northern Rockies, 2 young kids, 16, 17, 18, whatever you were. Number one, just kind of discovering this fly shop in Livingston that you had heard about, right? It wasn't like, you went on Google and searched it and then drove there on Google Maps or anything ridiculous like that, right? You stumbled onto it, didn't you?
That's the only way we found it. I just happened to look up and I saw Dan Bailey's fly shop.
Yep, you stumbled into it, and then you're in there and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy's, got these ladies tying flies in here. I've got a rod rack over here. I can actually look at an assortment of fly rods. And then you're looking at them, and then the man comes up behind you and says, how can I help you fellas?
That's where... When I turned around and saw Dan Bailey, I knew exactly who he was.
Sure.
And his gentle voice and his personal persona. Yeah. You couldn't ask for a better introduction to that man.
Wow.
And he asked us, he says, where are you guys from? And I told him, and I gravitated to the busted tip on my rod. Yeah. And he says, well, why don't you go get it and let me see it? So I ran around. I had to run across the street, and remember that was a highway. Yeah. And I had to dodge traffic. I couldn't wait to get in that store again. And
that's another thing. Dan Bailey asked you to go get your broken fly rod tip so he could look at it.
Yeah, he was going to try to fix it for me.
Wow.
I brought it in the store, and I handed it to him, and he's looking at it. He's examining the pieces, and he says, you know what, son? He says, it's a goner. I remember that. It's a goner.
I love that. It's a goner.
It's a goner. I didn't know what I was going to do next. Yeah. I thought, well, it's a goner. I'm just going to have to live this thing in memory of this trip. Yeah. Well.
And you built this rod.
This is that rod that I bought at Sears. Okay. That was a Ted Williams
Okay,
special.
Excuse me. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. And he's spinning the rod rack, and he stops and he pulls a rod out of there. And he takes the reel off of my rod and puts it on there and strings it up and shows me how to put a leader on. Because he asked me, do you know how to put leaders on? Didn't know anything, So it was a learning experience as well.
Wow.
Anyway, when he got done, he says, here, take this rod and use it. And all I ask is when you get done with it, you bring it back. I didn't know the man from Adam. And, what a blessing to have stumbled onto this kind of individual with the knowledge and the history and and being as famous as he was a celebrity to me. And wandering around in the store, I looked up and he had a wall that was painted green, and there were silhouettes of trout on that wall, and it was called, I believe, the Wall of Fame. If you caught a fish over 3 pounds or whatever it was, you could have your fish outline put on that wall. And I thought to myself, one of these days I'm going to have one of my fish up there on that wall. And it's just a dream.
Yeah.
And
well, he still has it, doesn't he?
I think it's still in there.
Yeah, certainly when his nephew ran it until it was sold in the last 2, 3, 4 years. It's Dan Bailey's interesting now. It is a fly shop, but they do a lot of other stuff in there, right? Like there's bikes now, and I think there's a bunch of non-fishing apparel. I think it's like almost an outdoor store in general, but same location. And there's no way they took those trout down.
Back in the day, when Dan Bailey put that together, it was a fly shop. There weren't bike parts or nothing.
Well, of course.
It was all product that contributed to the sport.
Yeah. I've had a couple people tell me that, like, okay, yeah, they've got fly gear in there, but you don't really know that it's a fly shop.
Yeah. I haven't been in there years now. Yeah. But anyway, when he handed me the rod and says, here, you use it, bring it back. And he gave me a leader that he had tied on it. And back in those days, they didn't have tapered leaders like we have today.
Sure.
You know, you built sections down to.
Yeah.
Well, I've never used a leader in my life. I didn't know how it worked. And as I got down to the end, I remember if I lose my fly, I'm toast, right?
Yeah.
Well, I bought 2 flies from Dan Bailey. I felt obligated at least to do that much. And I bought a black Nant and a Joe's hopper.
Wow.
50 cents a piece.
50 cents a piece, I was going to
50
ask
cents
you. Which was quite a bit back then.
Well, that
I
was
mean,
probably
right?
halfway of my vacation money, you know.
Yeah, 50 cents a fly. Wow.
But I bought those flies, and I remember when...
And I sell a Joe Hoppers in 2024 for $2.95. Just to kind of give you an idea, $2.95. That's what I sell a Joe's Hopper for. And I still stock a Joe's Hopper.
It's an infamous pattern.
Yeah, I still stock it.
Works all over the world.
For sure.
I've fished it in Chile.
Yeah.
And all over.
Yeah.
Anywhere there's a trout,
Yeah.
they'll take that fly.
Wow. It's crazy.
But getting back to that time period, when I bought those flies, and Dan told me, he says, here's something you might try doing. He says, he broke a section, and he showed me how to tie that hopper. He grabbed the hopper, and he tied it in between the tapered, and he says, leave that on there, because sometimes when you're fishing, you didn't say nymphs, but underwater flies or whatever you're using, a fish will come up and grab that.
Sure.
Well, when I look back at that from that time period, basically it was an indicator. That's what it was. It was an indicator.
Sure.
And he was the first guy that ever told me to try that, and it worked.
Wow.
And I caught fish on it. And from that time on, it was always fishing nymphs, put something on the surface as well.
Sure.
Even if there's not anything coming off.
No, and yeah, I mean, and once you get into the mid to late summer here, and certainly the spring too in Montana, talking to customers about a dry dropper, a hopper dropper is a superb technique. You're saying Dan Bailey started that?
Yeah, he's the first one to introduce me to that style of using it as a bobber. We didn't have bobbers back in those days, fly fishing, but I've always tried that, and it works.
Oh yeah, it works.
You never know what a fish is going to take.
No,
you can throw anything you want at them; they decide what they're going to eat, not you.
So skip ahead, please, from these experiences in terms of formulating your love and passion for the sport to where you finally got into the sport. Because something that we've been talking here for a fair amount of time, and something that's never come up is the BigHorn River Lodge.
Yeah.
So when did you? How about the court case? Give me a little bit give me some meat here. Tell me about your court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And it wasn't my case per se.
Okay.
What it was and how it worked, I'd been fishing the BigHorn since 1969, before it would become famous.
Okay.
Because that court case come to light in 80.
Okay.
I was arrested in 68, I believe it was. And back in those days, you never saw anybody on that river.
Oh,
you got to remember that dam was completed in 66.
Okay, wow.
So now we got a fishery that nobody knew existed.
Wow. How'd you find out?
Well, that's an interesting question.
How'd you find out?
Dave McLean, this buddy of mine, married Tim Babcock's niece. Tim Babcock was the governor of the state of Montana at that time.
Wow.
And they owned Babcock and Lee Trucking. And they used to haul cement up to the dam. They were suppliers of the dam. And one day, one of the drivers told us, he says, you guys want to go up there and fish, poke around? Sure, we weren't going to say no. Jumped in that semi, and away we go.
And you were in Billings, right?
Yeah,
give or take?
In Huntley.
Okay, but gosh, so you're talking about 80 miles away. And, again, 80 miles away was a big deal.
Oh, absolutely.
It's nothing now, but it was a big deal back then.
Marilyn's parents moved to Huntley. And I remember when riding the school bus, nobody wanted to talk to her, sit with her, or anything. And I thought, well, I'll sit with her.
Yeah.
And I did through our junior year in high school. And I used to tell her, you know, Marilyn, Dave's got a crush on you. And then I'd tell Dave, Marilyn's got a crush on you. So putting the two together was probably my doings.
I wish
So
I had
happened-
a crush on somebody right now. Aren't those fun?
Oh, yeah.
Damn.
Experience.
Ooh.
But anyway, that senior year, they changed the bus routes around, and
Yeah.
David was going to ride our bus.
Yeah.
So where's he going to sit? Sit with me in Maryland. And that kicked off the relationship.
Wow.
But anyway, getting beyond that, that's how we got up to the dam, is because her dad, Bill, and
Drove you up.
drove us up, and he brought us back. Jumped out of the truck, and away he went. And that's how I first was introduced to the Bighorn.
Okay.
But I didn't start really fishing it really heavy until '69.
Okay.
And back in those days, we didn't have a drift boat. You know, if you could build a Tom Sawyer raft, you'd go down the river in it.
Yeah.
But,
Was the fishing better back then?
you know, it's interesting that you ask,
know?
because in the early years, rainbows weren't in that river yet.
Wow.
There were brown trout,
Yeah.
and the introduction of the rainbow was a hybrid. You got to remember, after that court case in 1980, when it opened up,
Yeah.
there hadn't been any history of that river. There wasn't any biological studies done on it or nothing.
Gotcha.
And we had a young biologist by the name of Wade Friedenberg who was given a blank sheet and said, here, start a history of the river. And that's how it all got started, you know, the history of the river.
Yeah.
And Wade and I become good friends because I was down there a lot, and he'd come over and he'd always asking me questions about the river. And anytime he wanted to know something, I'm not a biologist or anything by any means, but I knew enough to where I could lead him in the direction he was wanting to go.
Yeah.
And so that's how that all started.
That's great.
But it was in about 68, I think it was, or 78, when I was floating down the river with a couple friends. And that day there was a jet boat on the river full of Indians, which I had never seen before. The Crows never fished, never saw them on the banks or anything like that.
Interesting.
And there was a plane in the air.
Yeah.
And we would put in at 13 Mile. And at that time, I had a jet boat. I was one of two people that had a jet boat in the area here. And we were at what's called I call it the glory hole, where the horses come down to drink and all that.
Yeah.
There's a little island out in the middle.
Yeah.
And we'd fish the split channel.
Yeah.
And that was one of my favorite places.
It's a good
And
spot.
I call it the glory hole.
God, what do they call it nowadays? Gosh, there is a name for it, but I know exactly where you're talking about because I've been fishing that area of the river and I've sat there and you hear this thundering going on, closer, 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 and then from across the river, there's this herd of beautiful horses that just, either cowboys directed or they're on their own or whatever, just walking across the river. So it's
something to see, isn't it?
It is. It really sticks with you. I mean, it really does. It's beautiful.
You would never think a horse would cross that river
Man,
like that,
they do.
but they do.
Man, they do. They can cross anything, so.
But getting back to what I was talking about, we were fishing that stretch, and here come that jet boat down that channel, and this Indian was standing up steering the boat. He says, "Follow me."
And this Indian, got any like uniform on or anything?
Nothing. He just street clothes, just
Yeah.
like the way they dress
Yeah.
normally. And I said, "Why?" He said, "Just follow." And he was being real blunt about the
Aggressive.
and aggressive. And Pat Wright, who was with me, grew up on the Crow and ranched on the Crow. And he told me, he said, "Phil, he means business. We better do what he says."
Huh.
So we reeled up our lines and followed him down to
Yeah.
where the pipeline hole is.
And nobody's on this river but you two. Like nobody's fishing this thing but you two.
There was another group of guys that fished the river at
Yeah.
the same time. And that was Gary LaRue, and he had his own little party that,
Yeah.
and they were at the pipeline hole, and the Indians had them pulled over.
Wow.
So we go down there, and I pull up alongside of Gary LaRue, and he's backing out, and this Indian's got a shotgun in his hand. Well, those guys take off. They head down the river. Now, I'm sitting there like this, and the next thing I hear, clunk, clunk, you're under arrest. And I had to pull in because I was going to pull out as well.
Yeah.
Pat says, don't do that. He says, go on in.
Yeah.
So I went in. They confiscated our gear and
Wow. For fishing.
for fishing, and took our rods. And
Which I want to not to interrupt you, but it's interesting to me. That was a big deal, wasn't it?
it was.
I mean,
made
that was
national headlines.
that was a big deal. Oh, it made national headlines.
Yes, it did. Do you know that case was watched closely by the states in the West Coast because it set a precedence over water rights?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what was so you got arrested? Like did you get detained? Did you get handcuffed?
No, they did. It didn't go that far. See, Indians didn't have jurisdiction over non-Indian on
Sure.
that reservation,
Okay, gotcha.
even to this day.
Yeah.
But what they did do is they wrote us out a ticket.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how they knew how to do that, but we had to go before Judge Banton, and he's a federal judge because the Indians are wards of the government. And anytime there's a case or whatever, they go to federal court, not court like you and I would go to.
Sure.
So Judge Banton ruled, well, he charged us $50 for trespassing and to appease the tribe. But he also ruled that that river belonged to the state of Montana, not the Crow tribe.
Wow.
And therefore the river was open.
And this is a non-tribal judge out of Billings. Is that? I mean, so the Crow tribe was actually able still to take this charge, and they were able to still put it before a non-tribal court.
It ended up that way.
Okay.
And during that time period, we were told that the river was open. Well, I get a phone call from the Fish and Game. They said, Phil, we know you're going to go down there and go fishing, but somebody's going to get killed.
Phil,
Because they were getting hostile.
Phil, we know you're going to go down there and go fishing. I'm sorry, but that's funny.
We're closing the river.
Wow.
So the Fish and Game actually were the ones that closed the river. It wasn't the tribe.
No, okay, well, that's fascinating. And they did that to appease the tribe? To avoid bloodshed?
No, they did that because, I guess in a way, the ownership of the river had to be clarified as to who owned the river.
Wow.
And the river,
Wow.
And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled, and it reverted back to Judge Banton's original decision that river belonged to the state of Montana.
Wow.
And therefore, it was legally opened again.
Wow.
And that was in 80.
Wow.
Well, we're all going to go fishing. And you got to the bridge there where the BigHorn crosses.
St. X there? Or?
Yeah, they had a blockade there.
Okay.
Yeah.
After this ruling?
Yes.
And a blockade meaning what? There were guys with guns on the bridge?
They were on the bridge. They had vehicles parked on. You couldn't have gone through there. You could almost not even walk through there.
Wow.
Well, they were trying to make a statement. But, just like everything else, it finally just dissolved, and the rest is history.
Yeah, wow. That's crazy to have been arrested on the BigHorn River back before the BigHorn River was even recreated.
And you know how that happened was really interesting. There was a young photographer that just got hired by the Billings Gazette.
Yeah.
And he was just walking around, taking pictures and all that. And his name is Lee Myers.
Okay.
You've probably seen his name on some of the photos.
Okay.
And even today, I think I don't know if he's still there with them, but...
is there a photo of you being arrested? Or, oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow, I'll have to look that up.
I'll show you a picture of that. I think I've got it on my phone.
Well, we'll save it here for episode 4. Okay,
Go ahead.
So thank you very much. This is now getting into the meat of why I had you here, right? To to be involved in getting arrested on the Bighorn River by a tribal representative, followed up by going through the court system in the United States and ending up in a pro-angler decision by the Supreme Court, which was all rooted in what? That they determined the state of Montana owned the fishery. Jeez. And how many millions have fished it since that day?
Oh, it's been incredible.
Crazy.
And you know, House Bill 2, I think it's 227 or 217, dealt with fishing on the banks. As long as you stayed within the high water mark, you could walk all of the rivers in Montana.
All the way to China. You stay on that river, you bet.
As long as you stayed within the high water mark.
Well, and I talk about the high water mark, and we'll touch on that here in our next episode. So thank you very much, Phil. This is Rich Ramirez signing out, episode 3 with Phil Gonzalez, East Rosebud Studios. Out.